Okay, good evening. Can you all hear me? We have a complicated double miking system. Can you hear me at the back? John, are you okay? Yes? Good. Okay, great. Welcome. I'm very glad to be able to be the first to welcome you tonight. There will be others saying welcomes as well. My name is Barbara Altman, and I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center here on campus. This is the second in a series of 6 events celebrating the bicentennial of Charles Darwin and the sesquicentennial of his landmark book on the origin of species. As you may have noticed, Darwin is getting a lot of press at the moment. His birthday is in fact on Thursday this week, I believe. And he is the cover boy of the science section of today's New York Times magazine, or not the magazine, but the journal. So if you want more when you go home, look up the Times and read what they have to say. Our series includes 4 faculty members from the U of O. We began with Patrick Phillips in January and had an overflow crowd for him as well, and he talked about the sex life of nematodes, so it was no surprise. This evening you will hear Professor Holmes, and then we'll have Joe Thornton in March and Francis White in April. May will bring 2 outside speakers. The first of those is Sean Carroll from the University of Wisconsin, who's coming on May the 4th as the Oregon Humanities Center 2008-2009 Robert D. Clark Lecturer. And then closing the series will be Kenneth Miller from Brown University, who will deliver the Criticos Lecture for the Oregon Humanities Center in this series on May 27th. So we had January, February, March, April, and then 2 in May. Please come to as many of them as you can possibly make. I'll be brief because I'm just the first of 2 warm-up acts. The Oregon Humanities Center, my unit, is one of the co-sponsors of this event, but there are many others. And that's testimony to the breadth of Darwin's influence. The other sponsors are the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, the Institute of Molecular Biology, the Institute of Neuroscience, the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, the Department of Biology, and the College of Arts and Sciences. We're especially pleased at the Oregon Humanities Center to be working on this series and a number of other projects with the natural sciences this year. I want to acknowledge our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, who enthusiastically leapt at the chance to collaborate on this series when the idea came up. I also want to thank the other members of the Oregon Humanities Center for all their hard work, including the striking poster that you might have seen. Those people are Melissa Gustafson, Peg Gearhart, Dylan Bragg, and Noel Alloy. Do have a look at the poster, which is all over campus and in a lot of places around town if you have a minute. Make note of the dates of the other offerings. But if you don't have that at hand, you can always find all the details of the other events on the website for the Oregon Humanities Center. So come to the U of O website and then go to Oregon Humanities Center to find all the dates and times and names. For now, and without further ado, let's get closer to the heart of the matter. I'm going to pass off to our next introducer. Our speaker for the evening will be presented by Scott Coltrane, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Scott?
Well, good evening, and thank you. I'm honored from the College of Arts and Sciences to be a sponsor of this event, and it is my honor to welcome Warren Holmes. Warren Holmes was born in and grew up in the Northwest. He received his undergraduate degree in chemistry from Willamette University in 1970, and his PhD in 1979 from the Animal Behavior Program in the Psychology Department at the University of Washington. We won't hold that against him. Subsequently, he spent 23 years as a faculty member in the psychology department at the University of Michigan, where he was one of the founding members of the Evolution and Human Behavior program. Each summer, however, he left the flatlands of the Midwest for the mountains of the West, where he did his field work on the development and function of kin recognition and nepotism in ground-dwelling squirrels, which he assures me are much more interesting than tree squirrels. Spending time in the West each summer also meant that After his field season ended, he could indulge in his true passion, which was windsurfing in the Columbia River Gorge. Warren retired as an emeritus professor and faculty member from the University of Michigan in 2002, and he came to the University of Oregon, where he is a professor of biology and psychology, and he's been here since 2002. Warren Holmes is the author of 40 scientific journal articles and chapters, including a publication in the prestigious journal Nature, and I counted from his CV a remarkable dozen articles, 12, in the journal Animal Behavior, which is quite an accomplishment. At Oregon, he teaches courses in animal behavior and in evolutionary psychology, and is a senior researcher in the Institute of Cognitive and Decision Sciences. Tonight, he will be describing some of his own research and discussing how a Darwinian perspective can help us better understand cooperation and altruism in all organisms. Please join me in welcoming Warren Holmes.
What kind of high sign will I get that we're...
I will wait for Julia to let me know when I'll get to go. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dean Coltrane, for that introduction, and it's a delight to be here. I've been asked to do what faculty members can easily do, sort of talk and spin his wheels for a few moments. Apparently there's an audio problem with the feed upstairs. So I could regale you with ground squirrel stories, but you really need pictures in order to benefit from that, so you'll have to wait just a couple of minutes. I guess I should ask the audience in here, and there are two different mics, can you hear me? Is everybody happy with the audio? Okay. Now, if I were to ask that upstairs, apparently the answer is no. So I will just continue to walk back and forth here. Well, I can do something since it's not very substantive. So I'm going to go ahead and tell a little story, and then we'll get on. Mention was made of Darwin in the science section of the New York Times today. Indeed, there were a number of articles. I encourage you to read Nicholas Wade's article. From that, I have taken some text that I would like to read and direct to the dean and any other high-placed administrators who might be here. So, reading from Wade's article, how did Darwin come to be so in advance of his time? Why were biologists so slow to understand that Darwin had provided the correct answer on so many central issues? One of Darwin's advantages was that he did not have to write grant proposals or publish 15 articles a year. He thought deeply about every detail of his theory for more than 20 years before publishing On the Origin of Species in 1859. I hope that the dean and other administrators will agree that Darwin's model for scholarship is one worth pursuing. And I did want to wrap that up with, yes, we can. I hope. All right, apparently, come on. Now it's gone to sleep on me. I can't find, is it right there? There we go. All right. In 1859, when Darwin published his Origin, he did two things that inevitably altered the way many of us view the living world. First, he documented with one fact after another that evolution had occurred. Species came and went. Descent with modification was real, to use Darwin's term. Second, and more importantly, he gave us a mechanism or process by which descent with modification could occur. That mechanism or process, natural selection. That is Darwin's true genius. Each of the three sets of organisms that you see in this slide provided challenges for Darwin's proposed mechanism because these animals, along with many others, exhibit striking displays of cooperation and even altruism in some instances. As far as I know, Darwin knew nothing about ground squirrels or meerkats, but he did know that some of their behaviors, and certainly some of the ways in which ants and other social insects behaved, did not fit well with his theory, and he worked very hard to explain them. What is striking is that many of our explanations today were there in 1859. So during the next hour or so, I will present some of Darwin's explanations for cooperation and altruism, and also offer more recent explanations that often began with his work in 1859. Let me see if I can help you understand a little bit about why, for evolutionary biologists, cooperation and altruism are potentially problematic. And I want to do so by introducing Andrew Carnegie and the Heroic Award that he instituted, I think, in the early 1900s. A quote, "I do not expect to stimulate or create heroism by this fund, but I do believe that the hero and those dependent on him should not suffer financially." Good thoughts from not necessarily the most heroic or altruistic man ever. An interesting caveat, the nepotism caveat. Ineligible recipients. If you go to the website, you will discover persons not eligible for the reward, members of the immediate family. A puzzle. Why exclude family members? Well, I hope that by the end of the talk tonight, you will understand why Carnegie excluded family members. Even if he didn't know why, hopefully we all will. So, my conceptual framework is one that you don't necessarily routinely work in. So for the next couple of slides, I want to introduce my conceptual framework. Those students who are taking my evolutionary psych class right now, who probably should be studying for the exam on Thursday, will gain a little bit by looking at this one more time. How does animal A exhibit behavior X? A very general question. There are two types of proximate explanations. Immediate causation, things like hormones and behavior, learning and behavior, socialization and behavior. The development of behavior refers to changes as a result of specific experience during the lifetime of the individual. And we're all used to asking questions about immediate causation and development and answering them in that framework. There is another way of thinking about why animal A exhibits behavior X, ultimate explanations. Evolutionary history or phylogeny. One way to explain behavior is to refer to the ancestral past. We behave like primates because we are primates, and primates behave in certain ways. Another way of explaining at the ultimate level, get that up there, there we go. The functional value of a behavior, its adaptive significance. How does it contribute to survival and ultimately to reproductive success? So proximate and ultimate refer to a temporal dimension. Proximate is short-term, explanations within individual lifetimes. Ultimate, on the other hand, refer to long-term, deep history explanations, explanations across generations. Not ultimate in the be-all and end-all sense, but in the sense of time removed. Let me continue with my framework by introducing some terms. If you look hard at this, I was so delighted when I found this. Alice is talking to Humpty Dumpty, who looks suspiciously like Karl Rove. And if you look real hard up there, you'll see the word truth. When I use the word Humpty Dumpty said, it means just what I choose it to mean, nothing more nor less. So let's talk about some of the important terms that I want to use tonight, cooperation and altruism. Cooperation in a proximate framework, behavior by one individual that's intended to benefit another. And certainly climbing partners are individuals who intend to benefit one another, to help each other. There is intention and motivation in their behavior. There's another way to think about cooperation at the ultimate level of analysis, behavior by a donor that increases the reproductive success of a recipient. The focus is no longer on intent and motives. It's clearly and purely on the reproductive consequences of the behavior. The donor pays a reproductive price, the recipient gains a benefit. And a picture of sisters, an older sister babysitting another, fits nicely into that category. We need to talk about another term, altruism. If you thought cooperation was slippery, I suspect all of us would agree that Mother Teresa was an altruist. I don't know that we would agree on much more than that. So let me be clear on how I'm going to use this term. Altruism in the proximate sense, a selfless desire to help others. That won't be my focus tonight. Rather, altruism at the ultimate level of analysis, a behavior that reduces the fitness of a donor and increases the fitness of a recipient. And I highlight donor and a recipient because I'll use those terms over and over. Fitness here refers to relative reproductive success, the number of babies an individual produces and rears successfully over his or her lifetime. The altruism paradox. How can selection produce a behavior that lowers individual fitness? And the exemplar for altruism is this female honeybee, the quintessential altruist. I suspect all of us, well, especially the males, have had intimate experience because as a kid we tried to trap the bee in the jar. What she does, besides cause enormous pain, is give her life in defense of the hive. Moreover, this sting has been evolutionarily modified. It evolved originally as an ovipositor, an organ through which a female would deposit eggs. It was modified over time until it had barbs on it, so now when this female injects this, it eviscerates her in defense of her hive. Darwin was aware of this and perplexed by it. So what I want to do, having laid out a framework, is now try and run through 3 functional explanations for cooperation and altruism. And when I say run, I don't literally mean run. That's the rest of the evening. First up, altruism and group selection. This is the way we wish the world was. Group selection. Groups of altruists will out-reproduce groups of egoists. The notion in group selection is that individual group members will restrain their reproductive output for the group good. So in order to avoid over-exploiting a resource, individuals will hold back because that's beneficial for the group. In Darwin's second great book, Sexual Selection and the Descent of Man, he wrote, "A tribe including many members who sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes." On the surface of it, group selection seems to make evolutionary sense. But, as I said, Darwin was ahead of his time. There's a problem, which he was very well aware of. He who is ready to sacrifice his life would leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature. So let's look at group selection, the old and then the new. Wynne Edwards published a book in 1962 which served an important purpose, despite the fact that most people would say he got it wrong. And it was a big book. What he did is lay out very clearly what a number of biologists had been thinking, a model called group selection, the notice of individual restraint for the group's good. So traits would evolve that benefited the group even if they harmed the individual. But what about the Eric Cartmans of the world? What about cheaters or free riders? Cheaters or free riders in a group of altruists are individuals who benefit from everybody else's altruism but don't incur a cost by behaving altruistically themselves. So Darwin was aware in the last quote, and certainly theorists today are aware, there's a problem. And it is this cheater or free rider problem. Things have changed since Wynne Edwards published his book. There is now a new kind of group selection referred to in different terms, often the most common multi-level selection theory, the latest in group selection logic. In multi-level selection theory, the comparison is on the power of selection within the group versus between the group. And depending on, that's exactly the way I feel about the old and the new group selection. And I'm not the only one, despite what some recent visitors to town have said. Kin selection, that you'll hear more about in a while, and new group selection are just different ways of conceptualizing the same evolutionary process. Both empiricists and population geneticists who develop models would agree with that assertion, and the empiricists would say, and it's a lot easier to collect data to test kin selection hypotheses than group selection hypotheses. Foster et al. Say kin selection is the key to altruism in a very nice article on the eusocial insects. I'm not going to say very much more at all about group selection other than if it is a significant evolutionary force, it may well be most significant for us and some other primates. Let's move on, though. Altruism and reciprocity. In 1971, Robert Trivers published his paper on reciprocity, mutual exchange of costly but helpful acts. And I think climbing partners are a great example of reciprocity because who's ever on belay now is going to be holding the rope for his or her climbing partner later on. Mutual exchange of costly, it takes some effort, but helpful acts. Trivers pointed out that in order for reciprocity to explain cooperation and altruism, at least 3 criteria had to be satisfied. Repeated donor-recipient interactions. If I scratch your back today, you better be around to scratch my back tomorrow. Low cost-benefit ratio. If I'm going to do something nice to you, there's no guarantee you're going to be nice back to me, so maybe just a small nicety rather than a large one until we get going in a reciprocal interaction. Finally, it's important to be able to recognize and recall donors and cheaters. This combination apparently has made reciprocal altruism in non-human animals problematic. Stevens and Hauser, in a nice review article a few years ago, wrote, despite immense theoretical interest, little empirical evidence substantiates the biological importance of reciprocal altruism in non-human animals. A few examples, but not very many, and given that there aren't very many, I am simply going to move on to the third functional explanation for cooperation and altruism, and this is the one that I want to spend a fair bit of time on. Altruism and inclusive fitness. W.D. Hamilton in 1964 published a couple of papers from his dissertation. For those of you graduate students who are working on dissertations, this is not something that you want to hear about, because many people would say that Hamilton's 1964 paper was the most, or at least among the most significant revisions of Darwin's theory ever. So if you want to go for it, do so. You have a tough row to hoe. What Hamilton pointed out is that if we think about selection designing organisms to transmit genes from one generation to the next, organisms can do this in 2 fashions, in a direct and an indirect fashion. First of all, ego, not the clinician's Freudian's ego, but our focal individual. Ego can rear its own offspring, and in so doing, influence ego's direct fitness. Ego can also influence gene transmission indirectly by helping ego's non-descendant or collateral relatives in their reproductive efforts. So, for example, helping a sibling is a way of increasing the number of nieces and nephews. This isn't the mathematical equation that Hamilton derived in his population genetics model, but it does a decent job of portraying this general idea of kin selection. So, what I'm intending to show here is that inclusive fitness has 2 components, direct and indirect. The direct, N0, is simply the number of offspring that ego rears successfully as a result of his own effort. The indirect component says that non-descendant relatives who are reared as a result of ego's help also influence ego's inclusive fitness. And this term right here, R, refers to, looking at the bottom, genes shared due to recent common ancestry. Some relatives are better vehicles for indirectly transmitting genes than others. Close relatives are better than distant relatives. R gives us a measure of closeness. And together, direct and indirect selection are often referred to as kin selection. So a drawing to make sure we're all clear on this, or everything else I say isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. And I played around a lot with this particular drawing, got some very helpful feedback from members of the evolution focus group when I did a practice talk last week. I'll be interested to hear from you whether this is better or not. We'll see. So what I want to do is explain genes identical by descent and helping. So to start up here, A and B are siblings. As a result of that, we know that they share on average 50% of their genes in common. Nope. The way things are set up here, A is going to help B rear some of B's offspring. That is, A is going to be taking care of nieces and nephews. That help is portrayed here is A, who provides some money to a sibling B, which allows the purchase of food or medicine or whatever, and as a result, B produces young. Now, if we're focused on ego, A, note ego can transmit genes directly via his offspring, A1, A2, A3, and A4. If you look at A total darkened square, what I'm trying to show you is that each one of his offspring share half of his genes in common. Half of your genes are from mom, half are from dad. I'm just showing one parent here. Notice also that B looks a little bit like A in terms of the way I have B colored, exactly half-like, because the degree of relatedness is 0.5. Look at the offspring of B. B is A's sibling. These, from A's point of view, are nieces and nephews. They share a quarter of their genes in common with individual A. So when A rears its own offspring, A is transmitting genes. When A helps its sibling B, A is transmitting genes. Now, where things get tricky here is I have suggested that indirectly A is responsible for B1 through B4. There's a problem here, and Hamilton was very well aware of it. It is only the case that you would include all four of these nieces and nephews if they were due to A's assistance. If A provided enough money only for B1 to survive, then that's the only non-direct or indirect connection to A. That didn't make sense. Don't worry a whole lot about it. We will not be visiting that again. Using this logic, let's move on to altruism and Hamilton's rule. Hamilton's rule is very straightforward, and that's extremely fortunate, because for those of us who back in graduate school waded through his 1964 paper, it was a real wade, and at the end it was thrilling to come down with a simple equation like this. R times B minus C must be greater than 0. If that is the case, altruism can evolve. So here's W.D. Hamilton. Here is a quintessential problem in altruism that Darwin was very aware of, these suicidal females. Hamilton argued that behavior makes sense if we acknowledge that R refers to genes identical by descent between the donor and the recipient. B is the direct fitness cost. Excuse me, I'm looking at that and thought I had a typo. It was a SPOCO. Direct fitness benefit to the recipient, and C is the direct fitness cost to the donor, where in the long run, benefit and cost are measured in terms of direct fitness increased or direct fitness decreased. Here's a quote from J.B.S. Haldane, a British biologist well before Hamilton's time, who among a couple, three others sort of saw Hamilton's logic before he presented it. Haldane is reputed to have said, "I would gladly give my life for 3 of my brothers." Haldane is 100% related to himself, half related to a brother, 3 times 0.5 is 1.5, which is greater than Haldane is related to himself. Ergo the logic. Or 9 of my cousins. Cousins, 1/8 of their genes identical by descent. 9 of them would be 9/8. I'll leave you to do the math. But it makes evolutionary sense. So, this is the general prediction that falls out of Hamilton's equation and thinking about inclusive fitness and altruism. The general prediction, the one that you see over and over in the textbooks. The social behavior of a species evolves in such a way that the individual will seem to value his neighbor's fitness against his own according to the coefficients of relationship appropriate to that situation. Remember, coefficients of relationship mean measured genes identical by descent. And a very important term or word in this is right there, seem. Remember, Hamilton is giving us a functional or ultimate level explanation. He is not too concerned about the proximate, the motives, the short-term thinking, the cognition that goes along with this kind of behavior. He is predicting individuals will act as though they understand inclusive fitness logic. Takes us to ground squirrel alarm calls. I said with my opening slide that Darwin didn't know about ground squirrels or meerkats. That said, I'm not quite sure that what I have highlighted or emboldened here is fair, but his quote, "The most common service which the higher animals perform to each other is the warning of danger." And given that I'm going to talk about ground squirrel alarm calls as danger signals, clearly Darwin thought of them as higher animals, even if he wasn't particularly aware of them. At least they have fur compared to Patrick's naked worms, which... So before regaling you with stories of alarm calls and nepotism and ground squirrels, what I want to do is try and present an ecological context for you to interpret what I have to say. So I need to tell you about Belding's ground squirrels' natural history. Belding's ground squirrels are sciurid rodents. That's one of those terms you can write down and hope it appears in a crossword puzzle or whatever. The sciurids are the marmots and prairie dogs and ground-dwelling squirrels, which truly are a lot cooler than tree squirrels. Tree squirrels are asocial except on campus where we feed them. Ground-dwelling squirrels, there are something like 20 or 23 species in North America. Most of them are group living. So if you're interested in social behavior and social relationships, tree squirrels make no sense. Ground squirrels make all the sense in the world. Another way I often describe the difference between these two taxa, tree squirrels are cats, ground squirrels are dogs, in terms of social and asocial. Adults weigh about a little over half a pound, 275 grams. This particular species, Belding's ground squirrels, are found in alpine and subalpine meadows in California and Oregon. They are obligate hibernators. They spend 7 or 8 months a year in a near-death state alone in an underground burrow. Females produce 1 litter a year during a single 3-hour receptive period. You see the headache joke that you're not coming? Okay. 3 hours, but they do make up for the short period of time because they mate with multiple males, up to 7 males in that period of time. Female typically will produce a litter of 5 young. In terms of rearing ecology, how do young grow up? And this is important for the story that will unfold in a moment. Females construct an underground burrow that I will refer to as the natal burrow, a few feet underground and maybe a 20 or 25-foot tunnel back to it. A female will give birth in that underground burrow, and her young will remain there for the first 25 days of their life. Their social world is very limited to their siblings and their mom because their only parental care that they experience is from mom. Male ground squirrels are classic mammalian males. They mate and run. We humans are remarkable and very different in that regard. That's one of the things that Darwin didn't talk about, and it surprises me that he didn't, given that he addressed so many other perplexing features. Paternal behavior in males is a mammalian anomaly, and that's intriguing. So only care from mom. besides providing nutrients and warmth to these underground babies, moms are territorial in defending a small area around their natal burrow, and they will do that because other adults, both males and females, will come in and attempt to commit infanticide. Indeed, one of the most significant forms of pre-emergence mortality is infanticide by adults. Dispersal by sex occurs differentially, and this has important consequences. At the end of a ground squirrel's first summer, at the end of its juvenile summer, the females will stay home, set up their own burrow within 20 or 30 meters of mom's burrow. The males, on the other hand, will disperse 400 or 500 meters. The result of this is that females live near close genetic relatives and males do not. Think about nepotism. The other point to make about females, because overwinter mortality is high, some 60% of juveniles fail to survive that first period of hibernation. That means that while a female will often live near a close female relative, another neighbor may not be a close female relative because some of those relatives died during the winter. Are females Hamiltonian nepotists? Well, there are two different things, at least, that females do. One I mentioned, territoriality and infanticide. I'm not going to talk anymore about that. What I do want to do is talk about alarm calls and predators and attempt to determine whether females act as though they read that 1964 paper. Act as though. So let's talk about ground squirrel alarm calls. Is this an example of kin-selected altruism? Let me introduce to you not a ground squirrel, but Mr. Ground Squirrel, Paul Sherman, behavioral ecologist at Cornell University. Paul and I collaborated for several years on our work on ground squirrels. He was particularly interested in alarm calls. I was particularly interested in kin recognition. You're going to get to hear about both. So, some background on ground squirrels. These little guys give two types of calls in response to a terrestrial predator, a single high note trill. Guess what's going to maybe come? And in response to an aerial predator, if you heard that and you were a ground squirrel, you would look around, not up, or excuse me, you would look up if you heard that call. You would run, and you may call as well. The benefit, these calls clearly alert vulnerable others. When a ground squirrel gives an alarm call, if you'd been ground squirrels, even given my crummy imitation, you would have been up and looking like this. Where is the danger? So it's clear that individuals are alerted to the presence of danger that they might not have known about. What about the cost? Remember, an altruistic act benefits the recipient and costs the donor. There is an increased chance of death. Why? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Here's this clown. Here I am. Thanks for the help. Notice this is the terrestrial. Aerial predators hunt with their eyes, not so much with their ears. The terrestrial predator's eyes matter, but so do ears. So calling to a terrestrial predator is definitely not a good idea. In fact, instances of predation are rare, but when they do occur, callers are taken twice as often as non-callers. It is very expensive to say, here I am. Much better to be quiet. This raises the question, is this risk incurred in order to warn kin? And if so, which kin? So what I want to do is look at, in a couple of data slides now, first of all, who gives alarm calls? And then secondly, who gives alarm calls? So these are data on the y-axis, the frequency of callers, and on the horizontal axis, various age and sex classes. So these are data from the first squirrel to give an alarm call. Remember, other squirrels will call in response. So it's the first one who presumably is at risk in response to a terrestrial predator. Now, to make sense out of the data, I have to explain expected by chance and observed in the field. Observed is easy. That's simply what you see. You count them. What do I mean, or what did Sherman mean, expected by chance? Expected by chance means calling in proportion to the number of individuals of a particular type that are present. So for instance, if there were 20 males and 10 females present when the predator appears, you would expect twice as many male calls to female calls. If there were 10 males and 10 females, you would expect 10 male calls to 10 female calls, okay? So let's look at these various age sex classes. Right away, we see that adult females are calling frequently, in fact, 2 to 2.5 times more often than expected by chance. They're really engaging in risky behavior. Sensible males, sensible in approximate sense, not in an ultimate sense necessarily, although I think there is ultimate logic in what they're doing. Notice for adult males, they're capable of calling, but they call much less often than you would expect them to based on their numbers alone. And if we look at the rest of the age and sex classes, yearling females, yearling males, juvenile females, juvenile males. Remember, the juveniles are the young of the year. The yearlings, guess how old they are? And adults are 2 years and older. Well, calling by chance for all age classes other than adult males and adult females. Let's look more carefully at adult females. We see some evidence consistent with a Hamiltonian argument for nepotism. Remember, males don't live near their relatives, so calling only warns competitors. They're silent, makes functional sense. Females, on the other hand, do live near relatives, so calling makes some sense. How fine-tuned is this sense? Here, Sherman and his field workers, and there were a good 20 of them over these data are over an 8-year period, so it's probably 3,500 hours of direct observation, and that doesn't include driving to and from and all that. These people know their animals. If we look just at females, again on the y-axis, the frequency of callers, on the horizontal axis, various kinds of kin alive in the population. So the same expected and observed as before. If we look at these females, these are females whose only living relatives in the population are either daughters or granddaughters. They're calling significantly more often than they would by chance alone. Similarly, if a female's only living relative is her mother or her sister, she calls more often than she would by chance alone. However, if the only living relative is a niece or a cousin, calling by chance. So females with close kin alive call most often. So to summarize, nepotism by sex. Remember, only females call. Females live near relatives. Males don't live near relatives. Given that calling is costly, it would make no Darwinian sense for males to call. It may make Darwinian sense, functional sense, for females to call, and they do. Sherman's second point, nepotism among females is limited. Females will call if they have a mom, a daughter, a sister, and or a granddaughter present, but if their only living relative in the population is a niece or a cousin, or several nieces or several cousins, they do not call. How do we account for that? Well, one possibility is that ground squirrels, and this is the one that Sherman suggests, that ground squirrels have not evolved the ability to recognize nieces or cousins. If you can't recognize them, then you don't know that they are alive in the population. We now know that the recognition problem is not the correct answer. Another possibility is on the benefit and cost side. We don't know about that. And so I'm just going to move on. I have some thoughts, and if you have questions, I'll be glad to share the thoughts. Hamilton's rule. I put the question mark here not to question his rule, but to question whether ground squirrels are acting as if they read the rule. The answer is, well, maybe, maybe not. Up here, consistent evidence. But I do want to make an important point. Remember, Hamilton said inclusive fitness has these two components, direct and indirect. The hooker with the indirect component is it's always multiplied by this fraction. genes shared in common. In general, it is going to contribute less to inclusive fitness than direct fitness. Another way to say that is, a functional explanation would go something like, organisms are designed to care more, to be concerned more about their direct fitness than their indirect fitness. Apparently, ground squirrels got that message, because look what happens when Sherman reports his data on response to aerial predators. Remember, these predators don't hunt with their ears, they hunt with their eyes. What would a smart ground squirrel do if it sees a predator and wants to avoid being a meal? It would in effect say, take somebody else, anybody but me, and one way that I'm going to help you is by giving a call that causes everyone around me to run. So, Sherman argues, in response to aerial predators, what we see is self-preservation, a direct fitness explanation rather than an inclusive fitness, direct plus indirect. Well, I mentioned something a moment ago that I want to look at more directly. Perhaps this not to nieces or cousins had something to do with recognition. So let's talk about kin recognition. Hamilton's general prediction is that cooperation via nepotism will evolve. Nepotism, favoring genetic relatives over non-relatives, requires an ability to recognize kin. You might think, a ground squirrel recognize kin? If you were thinking that way, you are making the same sort, you are working in the same proximate, I was going to say you were making a mistake, but there's another way to phrase it. You are working in that proximate framework, the same one that a well-known anthropologist was in, and he should have known better. When he said of the peoples that he was studying, Hamilton made no sense for these people because these people could do numbers, whole numbers up to 4. They didn't understand fractions at all. That's one of those, it's a great quote, and we love it because it allows us to make this very important point here about kin recognition. Kin recognition doesn't mean analyzing DNA. Kin recognition refers to differential treatment of kin based on correlates of genetic relatedness. Not of genes identical by descent, but things that correlate with genes identical by descent. You can't wait to find out what they are? Well, let's do it right now. How do you know who your siblings are? The first answer that comes to most people is, oh, the jerks that I grew up with. Maybe that's not the case. I'm one of 3 brothers. Fortunately, I'm the oldest. The other 2 were occasionally jerks. I know they're my sibs because I grew up with them. That's a better way to do it. Correlates of genetic relatedness. Family resemblance. Everyone has heard something like, you, at one point anyhow, look just like your Uncle Mary or your, no wait a minute, it would be your Aunt Mary or your Uncle Bill. Relatives are more phenotypically similar than non-relatives. So phenotype matching, comparing some image of kin with this unknown individual and ask how similar is the phenotypic resemblance. By phenotype, I simply mean those aspects of an individual that you can see, smell, hear, the external manifestation of the genotype, if you will. Another correlate, and one that I want to talk about, prior association or familiarity. In my little drawing here, or picture, here's a litter of newborn ground squirrels. Here is that same litter having emerged above ground. Remember, I said in the case of Belding's ground squirrels, those little guys are going to spend 25 days together in intimate association. If, when they come above ground, they distinguish former rearing mates from non-former rearing mates, familiar from unfamiliar, they are acting as though they have done a DNA analysis and identified siblings versus non-siblings. How could you go about testing prior association? You can phenotype matching. Way too complicated for me to try and make sense out of it. So let's talk about prior association, which is probably one of the most common kin recognition mechanisms in the animal world. Experimentally, there's a very straightforward way to test this mechanism. You can mix up kinship and familiarity. If you're working with ground squirrels and they cooperate, so here's a mom that has 4 babies, and here's another mom the same morning that has 4 babies. You can take these 2 and foster them to her, these 2 and foster them to her. So you now have some individuals who are growing up together that are siblings. They share genes identical by descent. You also have individuals who are not growing up, who are growing up together but do not share genes in common. As long as these 2 moms are not relatives, when you do your cross-fostering, you have some genes in common and others without genes in common. After doing this switch, you can let the young grow up and then do a paired encounter test. Take pairs of ground squirrels, put them in a small neutral enclosure, and watch them for a period of, once you figure it out, it takes 15 minutes of observations, and you record the frequency of agonistic behavior. Agonism is a combination of offensive and defensive aggression. So paw swipes, bared teeth, growls, which I won't even try and do, a bite, I definitely won't try and do a bite. Those are examples of agonism. When we did that in the laboratory back in Michigan, we found a very clear result. Familiarity mediates sibling recognition. In order to make the outcome clear, the light bars are individuals that were reared together regardless of genetic relatedness. The dark ones are individuals who are reared apart regardless of relatedness. What you see, the together pairs are noticeably, significantly less agonistic than the apart pairs. A clear familiarity effect. Remember, burrow sharing correlates with relatedness. Perfectly acceptable correlate to identify siblings in the case of ground squirrels. Turns out that that's not completely true, and I'm not going to go down that path unless somebody asks about it. And I gave you a hint. Remember those oversexed females? Siblings reared apart. The sibs reared apart do look to be a little bit less aggressive than the non-sibs reared apart. And in fact, when you do the statistical test, this is one of those just killers, significant at the 0.07 level, not the magic 0.5. What does it mean? Well, at the very least, it means, and given the natural history of ground squirrels, let's look at females in particular. So here, the sibs are the open bars, the non-sibs are the hatched bars. Again, mean agonism, and male-female pairs and male-male pairs. No difference as an effect of relatedness. However, look at what happens when we turn to the females. Sisters are significantly less aggressive than non-sisters. Sisters act as though, even reared apart since birth, they can still recognize an individual with whom they share, on average, 50% of their genes in common. How they do it is a whole other story. In terms of the sensory system, I should have mentioned this earlier, it's the nose, but there's more to it than that. Let's move on. The development of nepotism. First of all, I want to make an important point, at least to me. Kin recognition is not the same thing as nepotism. Nepotism, fitness enhancing aid to relatives. So, for example, alarm calls might be an example of nepotism. Here's a delightful poster of lion nepotism. The question that I want to address, since I'm interested in development in a functional framework, how do we get from non-nepotistic juveniles, remember they weren't alarm calling, to nepotistic adults? One of the things that ground squirrels do a lot of is social play. I wondered, based on lots of time in the field, whether the play partner preferences that juveniles displayed might lay the developmental foundation for adult social relationships, for adult nepotism. So here are a couple of ground squirrels playing together. What I want to do now is, I don't know, maybe I'm just presenting you an excuse for why I wanted to spend a few thousand hours watching. It's a lot of fun. That's the reason. So let's talk about assessing social preferences. For 12 or so years, graduate students, undergraduates, and I have worked at a field station in the eastern Sierra in California near Mammoth Lakes, a wonderful place to spend part of the summer until the wind starts blowing in the gorge. So at the Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Laboratory near Mammoth Lakes, it's about 40 miles south of Yosemite. At Snarl, we built some large outdoor enclosures, and here is one of them. This enclosure is 30 feet this way by 30 feet that way. And if you look at those black triangles, they represent burrows. We put burrows with PVC pipe and an underground nest box, 4 of them, so we could put litters of ground squirrels into these enclosures. What you see here are 4 juveniles that have come above ground from their underground burrow and are sitting on their porch. So within an enclosure, there could be 4 litters. That's 16 juveniles and 4 adult moms. And we would watch play right here, or like that. So for the first 10 to 12 days after young come above ground, my assistants and I would each day watch these Lady Clairol fur dye marked. All ground squirrels look alike to me, to all of us, I suspect. So fur dye allows us to recognize individuals. We recorded the frequency of social play as a function of a number of things. So, siblings are preferred play partners. That's the punchline here. The mean frequency of play on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, 3 different groups. Captive reared means young whose moms were pregnant when we brought them into the laboratory, cross-fostered them at birth, and then did the observations in the enclosure. Field reared were young who were reared by their moms in the field. On the day they came above ground, we were right there to live trap the young, bring them into the enclosure, watch them for 10 days, 2 weeks, and then put them back where we got them. And reducing from 4 to just 2 litters to make sure there wasn't a density problem. In all instances, what you see is siblings are preferred play partners. The frequency of play is significantly greater for siblings than for non-siblings. Keep in mind, this is quite dramatic because for one individual, there are only 3 sibling play partners. There are 12 non-sibs. So these preferences are quite robust given that by chance alone, they're going to bump into non-sibs much more often than siblings. One of the interesting things we found about these preferences is that moms have something to do with them. Mom's presence influences social development. Here what I show is the result of just one group. When juveniles were put into the enclosure at their natal emergence age without moms and observed for a period of 10 days, 2 weeks, there now is no significant sibling preference. What is it that moms do? Well, we still don't know for sure, but one of the things that seems to matter is that the absence of moms influences sleeping burrow use. So here on the y-axis is the percent of individuals who are sleeping with a sib. In one group, when moms are present, over the first 7 days in the enclosure, siblings sleep together in their common burrow every night. However, if moms are not present, when you put them in, the kids sleep together because they don't have a choice. But look what happens on the second night and subsequent nights. In the absence of moms, sibs are no longer associating at night, suggesting that something about associating at night is important to these social preferences. The retention of social preferences. We're still trying to deal with this developmental issue, non-nepotistic juveniles, nepotistic adults. Right in here is what I was showing you before, where there was a clear sib preference. But look what happens later on in the summer. It seems to disappear. What's going on in the summer really is the name of the game is no longer social. The name of the game is fat. If you are a ground squirrel, you cannot have too much body fat with you when you go into hibernation because you don't cache food. Yes, you turn your physiology almost off, but you still need calories to keep you going. So out here, what's going on is a lot of intense foraging. Are these preferences retained? They're there in juveniles, so how do we answer this question? Well, the first thing that we do is send the squirrels back to Michigan, where they hibernate individually, deep torpor for a period of about 8 months. Importantly, this is solitary. They're removed from all conspecifics. We are then going to assess their social preferences after this hibernation period. We're going to do the same kind of paired encounters that we had done before as soon as we take them out of the cold room. And then about a week later, we're going to ship them to California, put them in the outdoor enclosures, and watch them for a period of time. Both the paired encounter data and the outdoor enclosure data show that the preferences that we saw in juveniles, the play partner preferences, are social preferences that are still there in adulthood. So for the paired encounters, if we look at the female-female pairs, non-siblings are significantly more agonistic. Now remember last year it was an amicable cooperative play. Now we're looking at agonism. In the case of both females and male pairs, it's clear that non-siblings are the targets of agonism more often than our siblings. When we watch them for a period of time in the outdoor enclosure, in two replicates, again, remember we're looking at agonism, siblings are significantly less agonistic toward each other than non-sibs in both replicates. So it does appear possible that adult preferences develop out of juveniles' preferences. Sadly, let me move away from the ground squirrels, at least sad for me, to talk about a couple of more examples of kin selection. Tiger, salamander, tadpoles have read Hamilton, or they appear to. These tadpoles will cannibalize non-kin and avoid eating kin unless they're very hungry. So when 2 or 3 females oviposit in the same pond, you have, from a tadpole's point of view, both some relatives and non-relatives. The name of the game is to develop as quickly as you can before this pond dries up. You can develop faster if you get more food. So what's food? If you're a tadpole, other tadpoles are, but non-kin are eaten rather than kin. However, if there is very little food available and the pond is getting very, very small, guess what happens? They start eating relatives. Direct fitness matters more than indirect fitness. Picture from the very beginning. These are big-headed worker ants who behave very much like a number of other eusocial insects, that is, the ants, bees, and wasps. As a result of an unusual sex determination system in the eusocial insects, individuals are more closely related to their sisters than their brothers, and they're more closely related to their sisters than they are their own offspring. Males arise from an unfertilized egg, females from a fertilized egg. As a result of that, the coefficient of relationship between sisters is 3/4, not 1/2, but 3/4. The coefficient of relationship between a sister and her brother is only 1/4. Coefficient of relationship between a female and her offspring is 0.5. These workers do not produce eggs themselves. What they do is care for eggs produced by the queen. And guess how they bias their care? They take more care of their future sisters than they do of their future brothers. And the ratio is 3:1. If you want to do the math, divide 3/4 by 1/4. Finally, cooperative breeding birds and mammals have been described. This is the Florida scrub jay, a classic helper at the nest. Florida scrub jays, this is a male helper. This is an individual who is an adult and physiologically capable of breeding. However, rather than breed, he stays home and assists his parents rear who? Their offspring and his siblings, rather than breeding on his own. So consistent with a Hamiltonian explanation. Now, the other thing I should say, if this male has a breeding opportunity next door, he will take it rather than stay home and help. Direct fitness trumps indirect fitness. But kinship and competition, not everything is as straightforward as Hamilton might have led us to believe, although I think if you read carefully, he still got these right. Meerkats and babysitting. As an excuse to watch TV, how many of you watch Meerkat Manor? Oh, come on, raise your hands. It's fun. Most of the dialogue, I am comfortable as a naturalist and a biologist. It gets a little cutesy at times. But the point I want to make, there are helpers at the nest in meerkats. This right here is an adult who did not she's a she, did not give birth to this baby. And yet, this babysitter will spend time at the natal burrow when all the other adults are going off feeding. Her weight will go down over time. She is paying a price. Importantly, Her helping is not correlated with kinship. So a simple Hamiltonian argument does not explain this babysitting behavior in meerkats. Even more dramatic are these male fig wasps. Their rearing ecology is very interesting. An adult female will stick her ovipositor through a fig and lay eggs in that, and another female can lay eggs in that, and another female can lay eggs in that. Within the fig, the male eggs and the female eggs, but the focus here is on males, hatch, and then the females hatch, and what happens? Mating. But before mating, what happens? What happens is very intense fighting between males, and they don't avoid brothers. This fighting is very intense. In fact, fratricide is common in certain species of fig wasps. So clearly, these males are not behaving in ways that benefit their non-descendant relatives. All right, we're just about there. The impetus behind our meeting tonight was the birth of Charles Darwin and a book that he wrote after thinking about it for 20 years. So what I want to do is wrap up by following Darwin's lead in his second great book, Sexual Selection and the Descent of Man, in which he offered some explicit thoughts about human behavior. In doing so, I must confess that I feel like I'm skating on thin ice for a couple of reasons. Actually, now the third reason, I'm looking around, I realize there's some of my psychology colleagues in the office, or in the audience. That's one of the reasons. Okay, so first, why am I anxious? Well, I have relied extensively on Darwinian theory and its extensions to explain my work in non-human animal behavior. My own work has given me very little contact with people, although some of my best friends are, yeah. Second, there are a number of evolutionary social scientists who have been studying behavior, human behavior, through a Darwinian lens. However, this approach is relatively new, and I think a lot of empirical work needs to be done before we will fully appreciate the real value of a Darwinian framework. I'm convinced it's going to be there, but as an empiricist, I have to wait and see. So, having said that, let me move cautiously out onto the thin ice. Do the words human cooperation or human altruism represent a Darwinian contradiction, given everything that I've said about selfish individuals and their genes? Well, my answer is a clear no. Richard Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene in 1976, second edition in 1989, the single most readable explanation of the gene's eye view of evolution, the quintessential gene-centered book. In The Selfish Gene, Dawkins gives us a useful distinction between genes, the selfish units that pass from one generation to the next, and vehicles, the bodies that live the day-to-day lives in the service of those selfish genes. So when vehicles share interest in common, so Dawkins argues, cooperation can be beneficial in a Darwinian sense. Shared interests can enhance cooperation. This is one of those pictures that you just couldn't believe it when you found it. To me, this picture represents a truly striking example of just how dramatically competition can turn into cooperation when shared interests align suddenly. Notice this is not a picture of the Republican Senate, who don't seem to understand. Anyway, Dawkins made an even bolder statement than this claim about vehicles and genes. Can we act against our own genetic interest? Yes. Given, according to Dawkins, given the brain that selection has fashioned in us, he argues that we can choose to act against our own genetic interests. We can rebel against these tyrants. So, thinking about selfish genes and cooperative vehicles may not fit with how you think about human cooperation, but let's remember the ways in which cooperation is at the very core of so much of what we do as a result of kinship and reciprocity. No surprise. So, Andrew Carnegie knew that nepotism was its own reward and didn't require a financial boost. Cooperation through reciprocity is such a part of our nature that if you say to anyone, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, they get it. There are at least a couple of other routes that evolutionary social scientists have been thinking about with respect to cooperation and altruism. Reputation management. Reputations matter enormously to social group-living creatures like us, to primates in general, in fact. And we view people who have a reputation for cooperation as ideal social partners, and we would like to be viewed similarly, I think. A link between cooperation and building a good reputation can start a positive feedback loop that leads to more and more cooperation. Altruistic punishment, what's that? Altruistic punishment involves three individuals. A is the cheater who treats B unfairly, the victim. Individual C is the altruist who will incur a cost to punish the cheater despite getting no benefit. So when economists play these kinds of games where A is giving money to B, if C is not happy with the amount of money A gives to B, C can punish A by taking money away from A. It goes out of the game, and C has to pay to do it. Gets nothing from it. Altruistic punishment. We seem to value fairness in social exchanges, or at least that's one interpretation of this, and altruistic punishment may result when our sense of fairness is violated. You might be interested to know that this altruistic punishment has also been described in non-human primates, which suggests that social policing has long been a part of our primate ancestry. And I would like to leave you with one final thought about cooperation and the role it played in the evolution of our ancestors and still plays today. The Many Faces of Cooperation, the title of a book by Bigelow. As I said, cooperation based on shared interest is common in humans, and cooperation may help us solve lots of problems. That said, let's remember that cooperation can be a means to serve many ends. Utterly true. Profoundly worrisome? Cooperation did it. Hopefully cooperation can control it. And in order to answer some questions, I'll leave you with something a little bit more enjoyable to read. The last, I believe it's the last, literally the last sentence of Darwin's Origin. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be glad to try and answer questions as you read along. So there are a group of people upstairs, and I won't be hurt at all, especially my students who should be studying for their exam. Anyone that wants to leave, please do so. Anyone that wants to stay for questions, including those people upstairs, I'm going to wait until they come down and, a minute or so, and then I'm happy to answer questions for a few minutes. So if you want to leave, do so. Stick around if you have questions. All right, I'm willing to talk loudly here, and if people want to continue to leave, that's fine. Anyone that's coming in, that's fine too. Questions that I can try and answer. You putting your coat on, or is that a question? Oh, I'm.
If kin selection doesn't explain meerkat babysitting, what does?
If kin selection doesn't explain those intriguing meerkats that incur this cost for babysitting, they're not taking care of their relatives, what does? Meerkats are a very interesting example of a species that displays high reproductive skew. The dominant adult male and female in the group are the breeders. Everybody else is a helper. And that's one of the reasons that meerkat manor is so interesting, because there's all kinds of intrigue going on among the non-breeders. How is a meerkat successful in a Darwinian framework? By becoming a breeder. Groups of meerkats are better able to defend territories. Large groups are better able to defend territories and breeding resources than small groups. So taking care of this non-relative may give you a small advantage toward a larger territory and maybe becoming a breeder. That's the Tim Cluttenbrock explanation to date.
Group selection, like your first explanation?
No evidence for group selection. One of the requirements for group selection is independent groups in which individuals aren't moving back and forth. Because if you have individuals moving back and forth, you don't have groups who are behaving for the group. And in meerkats, you don't have this degree of isolation. In fact, that's one of the general problems with group selection. At least the early models required groups to be so closed that it's just not the way it is in the real world. Yes?
You mentioned a few other mammals. Like the prairie dogs, similar to the ground squirrels.
John Hoagland would say, no, Belding's ground squirrels aren't the Cadillac of mammals, prairie dogs are. This is somebody who he's probably watched them for 20,000 hours. So the question, thank you. The question was, what about prairie dogs? A lot of the ground squirrel story is paralleled with prairie dogs, the alarm calls in particular. Although one interesting thing, prairie dog males call. Guess what prairie dog males do after mating with a female? They stay right there. So they may be good dads in that they're warning their offspring. The females also call in ways that are very similar to ground squirrels. So a similar kin-selected argument. Yes?
So how often are 4 siblings or 5 siblings in the Beldings not related through a father? How often do you see different fathers in a litter?
So this is my opportunity to tell you about these females in the 3 hours. I'm going to rephrase the question. So if she mates with these 2 males during the same period, what happens? Sherman's DNA analysis shows us that of these 4 kids, these 2 were sired by 1 male, and these 2 were sired by the other male. And females typically mate with 2.4, as I recall, males. So multiple mating is the rule, not the exception. So when I was talking about siblings, I'm lying. I really should talk about litter mates, because some of them are full sibs and some are half sibs. What is remarkable is that when Sherman watches these females as adults in the field, the littermate full sisters cooperate more and fight less than do the littermate half sisters. These are individuals that gestated in the same uterus, suckled from the same mom, lived together for the same 25-day period, and they still, Hamilton would be proud, can distinguish a full sib littermate from a half sib littermate. Does that answer it?
So what is the recognition mechanism?
So what is the recognition mechanism? It's olfactorily mediated, and the answer is something that when we proposed it, I thought, well, we were just trying to be thorough. I didn't know that eventually we would be able to demonstrate this. Self-referent phenotype matching. The argument here is that a ground squirrel, she, because it's a female story, a ground squirrel knows very well what she smells like. When she encounters another individual, to be very anthropomorphic, she says, how similar is your smell to me? If you smell a whole lot like me, and if you're familiar, because we grew up together, I'll put you in the full sib category. On the other hand, if we grew up together and you smell only a little bit like me, I'll put you in the half-sib category. So it's similarity to self. Not cognitive awareness or anything like that, but they behave as though they understand their own smell and do this compare and contrast.
So have you looked at the biochemical signatures to generate these olfactory responses?
Have we looked at the biochemical basis of these olfactory signatures? That's a tough one to do in mammals in general. The people that have made a lot of progress have been looking at hydrocarbons in eusocial insects, and they have a pretty good handle on it. What has been done, Jill Mateo, a psychologist, former student of mine at the University of Chicago, asks the ground squirrels to do an olfactory assay. So she will present to a subject an odor from, and by doing controlled breeding, she can create these odors. An odor from a full sib or a half sib or a cousin. And by breeding, she can also create, I'm not going to get it right, a sib that is more than a sib. If a brother and sister inbreed, the offspring are full sibs, they share more than half of their genes in common. Jill has played around with this, and what she discovers is the ground squirrels identify, and when it gets beyond cousin, it stops. So it looks like that's when less than 12.5% of genes shared in common, that's when they start having problems. So pretty fine discriminations based on the nose. What the actual basis of these signals is, it may have something to do with the MHC system, the major histocompatibility complex. There's a lot of theorizing along that. Yes? I'm not... I'm sorry, I still can't hear. Very intriguing question. If you're interested, you should volunteer to be a field assistant with Jill Mateo, because she's, the question is about mate choice, which is the other functional explanation for kin recognition. Nepotism is one explanation, the other is mate choice. Everyone knows that avoiding inbreeding is a good thing to do, and ground squirrels avoid inbreeding. There are other reasons why selecting certain mates would be beneficial, like choosing a mate whose immune system will complement yours rather than be just like yours. So olfactory cues are important in mate choice. Ground squirrels do avoid inbreeding, and in some of the studies that Jill has done, because she needs to create varying degrees of relatedness, she does breedings where she will put males and females together who are relatives, and they didn't grow up together, and they won't mate with one another. So they're using their recognition here to avoid inbreeding rather than to be nepotists. Yes?
I observed a colony of ants, worker ants, marching through a kitchen of my own. And I killed some of them because I finally couldn't take it anymore. And I observed that the ants would stop and carry off the carcasses of their fallen sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, was I observing some sort of honor, or was this cannibalism?
That's one that I don't have a good answer for. It's certainly the case that ants in colonies will remove debris, including other dead ants, and that's probably just about colony hygiene. I don't know of any evidence that this is for food, for cannibalism. In the case of ground squirrels, one of the functional explanations for cannibalism, or approximate explanations, is food. In ants, I don't think that it's that. So that.
I mean, this was not their colony, it was my colony.
Yeah, so these ants were in her kitchen, they weren't in their colony. Your kitchen is a novel environment for an ant, and it's perhaps not surprising that the behavior that has been part of their evolutionary past is manifested even in this environment that somehow isn't quite right. That's the best I can do.
So you don't think that this was some sort of
No, I don't think it's some sort of honorable act. And I'm very glad you didn't ask that about a primate, because I don't know. In ants, I'm not worried about it. It gets more complicated. Yes?
Since the modern synthesis, evolution is, it seems that the paradigm is that evolution is either mediated genetically or epigenetically. How does behavior fit into this model? Do we assume that all behaviors are somehow mediated through our genes or through the expression of our genes, or can they occur outside of that realm? And if so, then is behavior still subject to natural selection in the same way that, say, a trait that we can identify an allele for?
There's no question but what studying behavior, if you want to link it to genes, is a real challenge. Much more so than linking genes to anatomy or physiology. But one of the things that Darwin was very, very clear about is he was presenting a mechanism that could account for the evolution of anatomy, physiology, behavior, and even psychology. So while the link between genes and the phenotype in anatomy and physiology, maybe we're starting to get a handle on it, the connection to behavior is much more challenging. Although there are some dramatic examples, especially of single gene differences that cause real differences in behavior. I would think that, to me, the answer to your question is yes, behavior evolves and is subject to the same laws of selection as anatomy and physiology. And if you really want proof, come back in 50 years. Lots of questions, which believe me, I'm happy to talk, but, well, let me say this. If anyone wants to leave, do so at any time. You can't, because you're riding with me. I'll 2 or 3 questions. So, in the back?
I assume that you think that evolution is still going on today. And what signs do you see of evolution in humanity itself?
Yeah. Is evolution still going on today in humans? And if so, what signs? My answer was going to be, I talk about the sticklebacks and the HIV resistance in mosquitoes, but you asked about humans. The problem, and this was a problem that Darwin confronted, evolution takes place across many generations. So it's simply the case that we cannot see change over many generations given our lifespans. I do think there is a lot of indirect evidence. One very clear example is the changes that have occurred in other organisms as a result of our choice to use antibiotics. We are changing ourselves, not genetically, but as a result of antibiotics that we use or don't use, there are different genes that are being transmitted than if we had not used them. So I think that evolution by natural selection is still going on, but I can't point to empirical evidence in the sense that we're taller or smarter or behaving differently. It's more an argument based on the whole logic of Darwinism. And part of what Darwin argued is we are subject to the same forces and laws of nature as are other organisms. Yes?
Are there any examples where this works in reverse, where someone of similar lineage to yourself is more of a competitor for a limited resource than somebody who's less genetic? The only example I can find is that your competition for genetically dissimilar mates that might be a scarce resource. Are there any examples of this?
So the way I hear the question, it's about competition between relatives. I don't know that I heard you say competition, but that's because they are similar. If individuals share genes in common and as a result share behavior in common, could it be that 2 brothers are interested in the same woman because their genetics indicate interest. They are competitors with one another. And Hamilton was very aware of that in making his arguments about inclusive fitness. In the case of fig wasps, for example, he knew that part of the problem was brothers were competing with one another and they were fighting to the death. Did that make sense? He said it made sense because direct fitness is not devalued like indirect fitness is by this coefficient of relationship. So competition between relatives is part of the story. It's part of the model. It hasn't been studied to the degree that the cooperation nepotism stuff has. One more question.
The kinship model is taking on genes, relationship of genes.
Mm-hmm.
Can that be extended, is it fair to extend that into relationship based upon societal paradigms? In humans, we find a relationship in our nation state or neighborhood or race or religion, those societal elements. And do you see any evidence in any of the species you've looked at that finds evidence of the societal aspect to that relation?
Chimpanzees. Real straightforward. That's, yeah, chimps. So the question had to do with larger groups, societies, communities, nations, and how might selection work under those circumstances. This is where it's very easy to start thinking in group selection terms, and a lot of the times that'll take you in the wrong direction. When asking about large group cooperation, it isn't a bad idea to ask, what do the individuals who make up that group get from large group cooperation? And there certainly are primate examples, and I think chimps are a good one. Some of the cetaceans, whales and dolphins as well, where you have small groups that come together, fuse, and then fission, and sometimes there are larger groups that are together. So that kind of stratification, group size, is part of species other than humans. Trying to make sense out of their behavior in a functional framework is a real challenge. That's why I like watching pairs of ground squirrels interact, or why I like to watch them play. That's just a lot of fun. So thank you very much for your attention.